There are legends that survive not because they were protected, but because they were necessary. Stories so bound up in how a civilization understood itself, understood its place in the cosmos, understood the very reason that human beings exist at all, that they were copied over and over again onto fresh clay, long after the original tablets had crumbled. Their even older oral traditions stretch across different cities, different cultures, different empires, passed forward, kept alive, and the story you're about to hear tonight is one of those. If you're settling in right now, finding a comfortable position, letting the day go quiet around you, this is exactly what this video is for. Because what we're going to explore isn't the version of ancient history that gets a single paragraph in a textbook. It's something older, stranger, and far more layered than most people ever get the chance to sit with. It's the full account of a group of divine beings called the Igigi. Where they came from, what broke them, what they became, and what they may have witnessed across the incredibly long span of ancient Mesopotamian memory. Because the Igigi story doesn't end where most people think it does. There's a version of this tale that gets told with far more frequency. A labor dispute between the Anunnaki and those who are deemed lesser gods. A resolution that could hold the secret to our own origins. And that version is real. It's documented. It's pressed into fired clay sitting in museum archives right now. But it tends to stop at the moment mankind enters the picture, as though the Igigi simply dissolved once mortals arrived, as though 600 divine figures who had shaped the earliest channels of the earth just quietly faded from the records. But what if that's not what happened at all? What many don't realize is that the most foundational texts to shape our understanding of the ancient world suggest something far more interesting, something that requires following the thread across centuries of cuneiform, through the slow shift of kingdoms, through scribal traditions that changed hands from the beginning of ancient Sumer, to Akkad, to Babylon, each one adding something, preserving something, and occasionally losing something irreplaceable along the way. And if you follow that thread, what you find is a stunning transformation, not an ending to their chapter that started at the beginning of ours. Tonight we're going to sit with both halves of their tale, the descent and the ascent, the grinding labor in the darkest soils of the primordial earth, and the far more profound responsibilities that came after, from their origins to ours. From the moment of organized defiance that shook the cosmic order, to the long and incredible aftermath that the more common version of this myth almost never reaches. Because after the rebellion, after the dawn of mankind, something happened to those 600 beings that ancient scribes recorded with a kind of careful and understated significance. They never just disappeared from the annals of history. Their role simply changed in ways that no one had anticipated. And the places they appear afterward, the councils they witnessed, the roles they were said to serve in the celestial skies, put them at the center of some of the most consequential moments in all of Mesopotamian literature. What draws people back to this particular thread of ancient mythology again and again is the quality of the questions it leaves open, not the dramatic ones, not the sensational claims that tend to travel fast and land shallow, the quieter ones, the ones about an ancient hierarchy of advanced beings, the exhaustion necessary to carry it forward, and what happens when the established order breaks down to such a degree that something genuinely new has to be built in its place. The ongoing questions about what it meant to a civilization writing its earliest stories into the earth itself by light of flickering oil lamps to imagine that the world was made this way, those are the questions worth carrying, yet so seldom asked. So tonight, as you wind down in the fading light of day, get comfortable, because we're going back a very, very long way. to a flat, marsh-edged world between two great rivers when the first written records were still new, and the memory of something older ran underneath all of it, quiet and persistent, like water moving beneath dry ground. But due to that, we must first start with what we know of the beginning, with what we can see and hold with our own two hands, because right now, in different locations across the world, there are rooms in certain museums where the air itself feels different. Climate-controlled, carefully sealed, kept at a precise temperature year-round, these vaults hold ancient objects that most people will never see up close. In the silent basement archives of our most treasured institutions, some of the oldest human memories in the world are stored in low, unassuming drawers. Fired clay tablets, barely larger than a paperback book. Some of them are chipped at the edges. Some are cracked across the middle. Some are missing entire sections, broken off somewhere between the moment they were buried and the moment a shovel found them again, thousands of years later. If you're listening as you drift towards sleep, this is exactly what this video is for. Pull the blanket a little closer, because what we're going to explore isn't legend in the loose, careless sense of that word. It's something older, stranger, and far more documented than most people realize. It's the account of a rebellion so significant, so fundamental to the way ancient peoples understood their own existence, that it was pressed into clay and copied across centuries, passed from one culture to the next, like a secret too important to lose. So, here's the question, just one of many that sits at the center of all of this. Do ancient Sumerian texts actually reveal why the Igigi rebelled against the Anunnaki gods? That question might sound mythological, and in one sense it is. But there's a physical artifact tied to it, a real object, sitting in a real archive, that carries at least part of the answer. And the fact that it survives at all is something of a minor miracle. Tablet BM 78941 is catalogued in the British Museum's collection of ancient Near Eastern materials. It forms one small fragment of what scholars call the Atrahasis epic, a long, multi-tablet narrative composed in cuneiform script sometime around the early 2nd millennium BCE. The tablet itself is baked clay, the upper right quarter missing entirely. The remaining surface densely scored with wedge-shaped impressions pressed into the material before it hardened. The script is Old Babylonian cursive, meaning it carries the particular compressed, flowing quality of a trained hand working quickly, preserving something that someone thought was worth protecting. And what's really incredible is just how old this story actually is. The Atrahasis epic predates the book of Genesis by hundreds of years, possibly more, and the oral traditions from which its scribes were recording go back further still, into a period so early that writing itself was new and fragile, not yet trusted to carry everything, not yet embedded in the daily rituals of administration and law. Whatever the people of early Mesopotamia believed about how the world came to be, and what role humans served within it, they believed it long before they had any practical way to write it down. What we have on those tablets is the crystallized edge of something much older. Scholars have spent generations piecing these ancient texts together, matching fragments from different sites, cross-referencing parallel passages, arguing about how to read damaged sections where the cuneiform is worn, or missing entirely. That same work continues today. And what keeps this particular text intriguing is that this isn't just a flood story, though the flood is in there, echoing forward into later traditions in ways that are hard to miss. But perhaps the deeper mystery is something else entirely, a divine dispute between the gods, and this is not meant to be taken in a metaphorical or abstract sense. The Atrahasis epic literally records a breakdown in the established division of cosmic order. as it was seen at the time. It records grievances, confrontation, institutional panic, and a negotiated solution that changed the very nature of the entire world. If you strip away the divine names and the supernatural framing, what you are looking at is something that reads remarkably like a documented account of organized workers reaching a breaking point, walking off the job, and forcing those above them to find another way. And that solution, that negotiated answer to the uprising, is where things become genuinely extraordinary. Because the resolution these ancient texts describe isn't a reassignment of duties or a reduction in workload, it came in the creation of an entirely new kind of being, a being fashioned from dark clay and divine blood, built to carry the labor that could no longer be sustained by those originally assigned to it. A being whose existence was, according to these texts, the direct consequence of this rebellion, which raises the question, who were these mysterious semi-divine lords of deep antiquity, and what pushed them to step outside the established cosmic order? To understand that, we have to go back, not just to the beginning of the story, but to the beginning of the world as these ancient scribes understood it. The Igigi occupy a peculiar position in the study of ancient Mesopotamian religion. They are, as a scholarly subject, an enduring curiosity. They appear across Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian traditions, always as a group, almost never as individuals. Unlike the Anunnaki, who have specific names, temples, personalities, identities, and entire literary traditions built around their specific stories, the Igigi are defined almost entirely by their mere function. They are workers. They are the ones who dug, and they are numbered in the texts at 600, an enormous collective presence that somehow remains almost entirely anonymous. But even that anonymity is in itself meaningful, because the older mythological traditions place the Igigi within a layered picture of cosmic ancestry. At the beginning of everything, long before the Anunnaki gods themselves, there were older and much slower forces. Ancient Mesopotamian cosmology describes primordial beings born from the very first mingling of the primordial salt waters of Tiamat and the sweet fresh water of Apsu. Among the earliest offspring of that primordial union were beings called Lamu and Lahamu. They were vast in form, slow in motion, and described in ways that suggest something like the ocean floor itself becoming conscious. They settled gradually to the bottom of the first deep waters as foundational creatures of silt, their eternal presence forming the earliest solid ground beneath the primordial sea, the first bedrock the world would eventually rest on. There's something almost geological about this image, and it's deliberate. These early cosmological layers weren't describing personalities, they were describing forces in and of themselves, the most elemental forces of nature, dense, passive, barely individuated powers that had existed so long that they had become indistinguishable from the matter around them. From those ancient ancestors, through a long succession of divine generations, came the Anunnaki, the bright and powerful gods who would eventually organize the world into something more recognizable. Chief among them were Anu the sky, Enlil the wind, and Enki embodying the deep waters and esoteric wisdom. These were not slow, elementary beings anymore. They were active, distinct, and deeply interested in the arrangement of the world around them. And therein lay the problem with the older generation. The ancient titans, the ones who had ruled the early universe with a kind of massive, immovable weight, were content to remain in darkness. They resisted change and had no interest in the kinds of organization and structure that the younger gods found essential. The Anunnaki eventually overthrew them, pushing those older forces aside in what the texts frame as a necessary cosmic reorganization, clearing the way for something new. But that act of rebellion, that overthrowing of the old order, inevitably came with a cost, because even once you have displaced the old guard and claimed dominion over the earth, someone still has to manage it. With Anu maintaining order from the highest heavenly realms, Enlil commanding the powerful winds and storms which swept over the earth, and Enki presiding over its underground oceans. These high gods could not simultaneously maintain the vast architecture of the cosmos and also get into the ground themselves to do the physical work required to reshape the world's surface. The hierarchy that made their authority possible also separated them from the labor that kept everything functioning. So the burden fell to the younger and lower-ranking gods, known as the Igigi. And before we go further, it's worth pausing on something that matters, to better understand what comes next. Because when mankind stepped into the picture ages later, those ancient eastern territories would later develop formal systems of what historians call corvée labor, compulsory work extracted from a population by a state or ruling institution as a form of civic obligation. You see it in the massive construction projects of early Mesopotamian city-states, where large groups of workers were organized by temple administrators to dig canals, raise walls, and maintain the infrastructure on which those cities depended. This wasn't voluntary. It was built into the structure of how their society understood itself. But here's what's interesting. The Atrahasis text suggests that this concept of inherent responsibility, of labor as an inescapable condition assigned by one's position in the order of things, didn't originate as a human institution. The Sumerians appear to have understood it as something much older, a cosmic reality, the idea that the younger pantheon, the Igigi, simply inherited the physical work of the world the moment the Anunnaki rose to power, reflects a worldview where labor isn't incidental. It's structural. It's built into the hierarchy itself, and the world they were assigned to work on was not a gentle one. Picture southern Mesopotamia before the first mud brick temples had been raised, before the first canals had been mapped by human administrators, before anything recognizable as a city existed on those flat plains. What lay between the borders of their horizons was a raw and relentless terrain, a low marshy expanse, cut through with seasonal flood channels, dense with reed growth in the wet months and cracked with heat in the dry ones. The land was not farmable without intervention. The water did not go where it was needed without being told where to go. The rivers flooded unpredictably, depositing new silt in one area while starving another of moisture entirely. To make anything grow there, you first had to reshape the land itself. You had to dig. You had to cut channels through the hard-packed earth, opening paths for water to follow. You had to move enormous quantities of material by hand over long distances without the benefit of wheels or iron tools or any of the machinery that later generations would come to rely on. This was the work that the ancient texts describe as the Igigi's sole responsibility. And they didn't just dig irrigation channels. The scribes who recorded these accounts explicitly credit the Igigi with carving the actual riverbeds of the Tigris and the Euphrates themselves, digging the very watercourses that gave the land its shape and character. They extracted raw minerals from the deep underground. They managed the earthly infrastructure that the Anunnaki required to be maintained, while they administered the larger order of the universe above. This was foundational labor in every sense of the phrase. Without it, the cosmic system didn't function. Without it, the gardens that fed the gods couldn't exist, and the world as the Anunnaki intended it simply wasn't possible. As one would expect from such a tremendous undertaking, the Igigi fulfilled this work for a very long time. The Atrahasis texts measure the duration in a specific unit, a sa. In the Mesopotamian numerical system, a sa is 60 squared, meaning 3,600, the base unit of their incredibly advanced sexagesimal counting system. The texts record that the Igigi labored for 40 sa before the rebellion finally broke out. That number, 40 multiplied by 3,600, carries the weight of what scholars understand as an incomprehensibly long period of time. It signals duration beyond the scale of ordinary experience, an amount of time so large that it bends the human imagination. Just think about what that weight would feel like. Not in years or decades, but in the context of daily existence. The same task, repeated across an expanse of time that has no visible end. The mud that doesn't stay where you put it, because the floods come again. The channels that silt over every so often. The ground that constantly shifts. The work that undoes itself and begins again and again. There is no finalized goal possible in this system, no moment of completion where the labor is declared finished and the workers are released. The task is ongoing, because the earth is ongoing, because the cosmic order that depends on this maintenance never stops requiring it. What the Atrahasis epic captures, in the precise and careful language of its cuneiform lines, is the moment that weight became too much, the moment when the silent endurance of 600 anonymous gods finally reached its absolute limit, and something irreversible began. But to understand how they broke, and what happened next, we have to first stand with them in the darkness, in the soft sound of a tool striking earth, again and again, in the long, deep silence, just as the great fires first signified an impending shift in the grand design. There is a moment in the Atrahasis epic where everything shifts, not gradually, not through debate or negotiation or any of the slow machinery of institutional change. It happened in the middle of the night, somewhere between midnight and the first grey suggestion of dawn, outside the walls of the Ekur, Enlil's great sacred residence in the ancient city of Nippur. The Sumerians called it the Mountain House, a fitting name for the dwelling of the god who ruled the air between earth and sky, who held the tablets of destiny and commanded the very hierarchy of the divine world. It's here, outside his sacred temple in that specific quiet hour, that the Igigi made their move. The records don't build slowly toward this moment. It arrives the way a crisis always does, suddenly, and after a very long time coming. The scribes who pressed those wedge-shaped marks into the clay were documenting what may be the oldest labor uprising in the written history of the world. And if you slow down and read carefully, you can feel the tension building in the lines long before the fire is lit. After all, it had been brought about by generations of extraordinary discipline. The Igigi had been laboring for around 450,000 years, by some accounts. That number carries weight in Mesopotamian literature, the way fours often do in ancient archives, whether you're reading Sumerian clay tablets or much later Hebrew scripture. It signals not just duration, but a kind of threshold, the outer edge of what any being can be reasonably asked to endure. Over 400,000 years of digging watercourses and hauling heavy material. 400,000 years of reshaping rivers and heaping up mountains without rest, without recognition, without any suggestion that this arrangement would ever change on its own. And so they chose to change it themselves. In the deep silence of night, their endurance had finally reached its absolute limit. Here's what the texts describe. The Igigi gathered their tools, the heavy spades and picks that had defined their existence for as long as any of them could remember, and they set them on fire. That detail is worth sitting with. They didn't simply set down their instruments. They burned them. They placed their spades and picks directly into the flames. and they watch them go. There's something in that image that feels less like a labor dispute and more like a declaration, a ritualistic show of permanent severance, as if to say, we will not carry these again, and whatever comes next, this version of things is finished. With their tools still burning, they surrounded Enlil's mountain house in the dark of night, forming a circle of gods who had built the very foundations of the world and were now refusing to take another step, until someone listened. The institutional panic that followed was immediate. Nusku, who served as Enlil's vizier and closest advisor, heard the rising noise outside their temple walls, the sound of the surrounding gods, the heat of the fire, the silence underneath it. He woke Enlil, and here is one of the most quietly remarkable moments in all of ancient Sumerian literature. It is said that Enlil's face went pale, drained, the way tamarisk wood loses its color in certain lighting. This is the god who both created and commanded the air between heaven and earth. This is the figure at the apex of the divine order, the one whose very word shaped the cosmos. And he was afraid, not just concerned, actually afraid, because the system he depended on was standing outside his gates, waiting in the dark, and they were not going away. In that moment, he felt something that the scribes rarely attributed to the highest gods: vulnerability. A sudden and dizzying awareness that the hierarchies he had built, the order he had imposed across the cosmos, depended entirely on the consent of those he had positioned beneath him. The Igigi could have been dismissed as insignificant. Despite being immortal themselves, they held no titles. They attended no councils. They were merely the workers, the invisible machinery that kept creation running. But they were also 600 strong, unified in purpose, and standing outside his house with burning tools. Enlil understood, in that pale and drained moment, that power is not the same as invulnerability. Authority without cooperation is merely the illusion of control. Enlil sent Nusku out to speak with the gathered Igigi, to ask who had organized this, to find the leader, the instigator, the name they could isolate and address. It's a familiar instinct, that impulse to personalize a collective action, to reduce it down to one responsible party. And the Igigi gave an answer that the texts record with a kind of quiet power. Every single one of us gods declare war, they said. The load is excessive, the work is too hard. There is no leader. And even if there was, there is no single name to be given. The rebellion didn't belong to any one of them. It belonged to all of them equally, and there was nothing Enlil could do with that. You can negotiate with a representative. You can punish a ringleader. You cannot punish 600 gods who have decided, unanimously, to simply stop. That collective solidarity is one of the things that makes this story genuinely strange to read, even now. The Igigi are largely anonymous throughout historical literature. We know only a handful of their individual names. As a group, they're defined by what they did, not by who they were. And in this moment, that anonymity becomes a kind of armor. Their strength comes precisely from the fact that no single figure speaks for them, that they answer with one voice, that their grievance cannot be narrowed into one person's complaint. They had built the rivers of Mesopotamia, they had shaped the mountains, and they had done all of it without their names being carved anywhere. The remnants of their memory left behind still preserve their actions, but erase their identity, which is perhaps the deepest irony of all. They had asked for nothing more than recognition. They had demanded only that the system acknowledge what they carried, and the answer the Divine Council would eventually give them was not acknowledgement, but replacement. Their work would be turned over entirely to creatures who would never even know the Igigi had come before them. The senior gods convened in council. Anu, the sky god, who held distant authority over the entire pantheon, being his children and descendants. Enlil, shaken and pale, with the noise still audible beyond his walls, and Enki, the god of wisdom and the deep waters, the one the traditions consistently present as the clearest thinker in any room. The question before the council was real and urgent. The Igigi were not simply inconvenienced, they were serious. They were prepared to wage war if their demands went unmet. This wasn't a negotiating posture. The Anunnaki had to reckon with the possibility that the beings who had done the fundamental work of creation could become their ultimate destroyers if pushed far enough. Enki listened, and then he said something that would determine the shape of everything that followed. The petition is justified, he told the council. Their labor is too heavy. What they're asking for is fair. It's a remarkable moment because Enki doesn't defend the system. He doesn't argue for order or hierarchy or the importance of maintaining divine authority. He simply acknowledges that the Igigi are right, and having acknowledged it, he begins to think about what to do instead. The assembled gods now had to confront something that the existing order had no clean answer for. The Igigi were not wrong about the conditions of their labor. Even Enlil seemed to understand this, if his pale face in the darkness meant anything at all. The question now was not really whether the complaint was legitimate. The question was, what could possibly be done about it? The framework of divine labor had been built on the assumption that the Igigi would continue doing what they had always done. There was no contingency for the moment they stopped. Even during this debate, it was Enki who spoke most clearly in the assembly. He was often the most practically minded of the senior gods, the one most willing to engage with the actual mechanics of a problem, rather than just its symbolic surface. And the solution Enki proposed was neither a punishment nor a negotiation. It was something far more consequential than either of those things. He proposed the creation of a substitute, which brings us to the part of the story, a part that many don't realize is in these texts at all. It is said that Enki descended, not upward, not into the councils of heaven, but down into the silent and subterranean realm he called his own. The Apsu, the deep freshwater that the Sumerians believed lay beneath the earth, beneath everything visible and known. It was Enki's particular domain, the place where wisdom lived in peaceful silence, away from the noise and urgency and the politics of the divine court. And it was there, in that underground stillness, that he began working on something new, gathering the elements, thinking through the design, finalizing what the tablets describe as his blueprints for a living being made from the earth itself, from clay and water and something divine mixed in, a being capable of taking on the labor that the Igigi could no longer be asked to bear. The process was meticulous, and despite the urgency on the surface world, Enki did not rush his work. He shaped the clay carefully, considering every aspect of the new creation. What shape should it have? What capabilities would it need? How much consciousness should it possess? These were not simple questions. To make something too intelligent might breed the same resistance the Igigi had now demonstrated. To make it too simple might mean it lacked the capacity to do work that required thought and adaptation. Enki was designing not just a new species, but a solution to a fundamental problem of cosmic management. How do you build beings resilient and capable enough to serve, but docile enough not to rebel? Above him, the exhausted Igigi waited patiently outside. We aren't provided with any accounts of their thoughts during this period. But there's an image that the landscape of southern Mesopotamia makes easy to picture. Those flat reed-filled marshes where the rivers slow and spread, where the water catches whatever light remains in the sky and holds it for just a moment before the dark comes fully in. The Igigi had burned their tools. They had spoken their grievance. They had done the difficult and irreversible act of protesting. And now there was nothing left to do but wait, listening to the water move in the darkness, letting the quiet of the marshlands settle into muscles that had been working without rest for longer than most civilizations have even existed. That waiting is its own kind of detail, because this legend isn't simply a story about gods and labor. It's a record of what happens at the edge of a system's endurance, when the beings doing the foundational work decide that they've reached the limit of what they're willing to give. The Igigi didn't ask for power. They didn't demand Enlil's throne or a place at the table of the senior gods. They asked to be released from work that was destroying them. And the answer the cosmos gave them, the answer Enki was slowly assembling in the depths of the Apsu, was not a promotion or a renegotiation. It was a complete replacement. The Igigi lingering in the dark outside the mountain house, with their spades still smouldering somewhere behind them, had set something in motion that none of them could fully see yet. What Enki was working on in the Apsu, down in the deep and quiet water, was the beginning of something that would reshape the entire cosmos and change the course of history forever. Not because the first creations would be inherently grateful or obedient, but because they would have no memory of any other way. They would be born into servitude and know nothing else. They would ask no questions because they would lack the historical context to understand that they were living within a system designed specifically to direct their efforts to a single, dedicated task. The Igigi had burned their tools and demanded freedom, but the beings who would come after them would never be allowed to see the bigger picture well enough to know that their tools could be burned. In this moment, the records quietly morph from a labor dispute among gods into something much older and stranger. The rebellion had ended, and the Anunnaki, faced with the collapse of the entire cosmic order, had no real choice but to find another solution. What came next wasn't simply a peace agreement between divine factions. It was the invention of a new kind of being that would carry the weight the Igigi had set down. But to understand what that new being actually was, in the Mesopotamian imagination, you have to understand something they viewed as foundational to their societies, something called the May. In the oldest translations, the Holy May is one of those concepts that resists a clean modern equivalent. The Sumerians understood it as the set of divine parameters that held the fabric of civilization together. Not laws exactly, not commandments, something closer to the underlying logic of the universe, the invisible structure that made cities function, that gave kingship its authority, and that allowed rituals to carry meaning. The May included things like truth, descent into the underworld, craftsmanship, music, scribal skill, and the art of governing. Each one was a cosmic principle as much as a practical function. Without the May operating correctly, the Sumerians believed the world would simply stop making sense. Order would dissolve. Society would come apart in ways that couldn't be repaired by any human hand. So when the gods discussed what to make of the Igigi crisis, the May was not in the background. It was the central concern. The question wasn't just who would do the digging. The question was how to keep the sacred parameters of existence in balance. The answer came in Enki's proposal. He was the god of wisdom and of deep water, but more than that, he was also a supreme lord of craft and archaic magic. His solution was precise: to create a being capable of terraforming and managing the earth, and to do it in a way that gave that being a genuine capacity to understand what the work required. Not a mindless body, not simply a creature of instinct. something more deliberate than that. Enki laid out his method with the kind of detail that suggests this was understood as a technical process of biological engineering, not a casual act. The ingredients were specific, the ritual was specific, and one element in particular sits at the center of the whole procedure, lingering in the heart of Sumerian mythology in a way that the later texts return to again and again. A god would have to be sacrificed, and his name was Wela, or Geshtu in the oldest traditions. He wasn't a major figure, he wasn't a member of the supreme triad. He's described as a god who had the spark of intelligence. That word matters. The Akkadian term used in this context connects to something the priests called temu, an inner quality of mind that went far beyond simple awareness. Temu was the capacity to plan, to reason across time, to hold a complex idea together long enough to act on it. It was closer to what we might call a higher logic rather than raw sensation or emotion. And Wela, this relatively minor god chosen for sacrifice, was understood to possess it in a concentrated form. His sacrifice was the pivot on which the whole creation story turned. Because between the lines of those ancient inscriptions, it is heavily implied that it was Wela himself who had sparked the desire for outright rebellion among the lower class of Igigi deities. They may have had no defined leader, but it was he who had provided the strategic intelligence necessary to stage such an effective mutiny. And so, for these reasons, it was he who was chosen. His very life's essence would be utilized in this grand act of creation. Here, the ancient priests describe a fascinating ritual, Wela's blood being mixed into clay, and Ninhursag, the birth goddess, helps Enki to carefully shape the mixture in their own image. But his blood doesn't simply animate the clay the way water softens dry earth. In their beliefs, it transmitted something much more profound. Wela's temu passed through the blood into the body of the very first human, embedding a quality of mind that clay alone could never contain. What this meant to the scribes who recorded it, and to the communities who heard it recited, was that human intelligence wasn't accidental. It wasn't a feature that simply emerged from physical form. It was inherited deliberately from an immortal member of the Anunnaki gods themselves, and that god had been sacrificed specifically so the transfer could happen. The gravity of that idea is worth letting settle a moment, because it shapes everything we ever thought we knew about our origins, about our capabilities, about questions that have hovered unspoken, but always present throughout all of human history. The gods themselves didn't treat it as a gift in the generous sense. It was a necessity of our engineering. The intelligence mankind inherited was functional. It was intended to solve a specific problem. The Igigi had refused to maintain the canals, the river channels, the irrigation systems that kept the world itself alive. These were not simple tasks. Coordinating the excavation of a major canal system across a populated floodplain required the ability to plan sequences of work, to manage groups, to anticipate flooding seasons and adjust accordingly. It required exactly the kind of forward thinking that Wela's light represented. The May and the concept of temu connect here in a way the texts don't always make explicit, but seem to assume. The May held the parameters of civilization, while temu gave humans the mental capacity to operate within those parameters. Without the May, there was no structure for human activity to follow. Without temu, there was no one capable of following it. The two together made something the gods apparently couldn't otherwise replicate, or didn't need to. A being who could sustain the complex work of a functioning world without constant divine supervision at every step. That's a significant claim for a mythological tradition to make about humanity. It's worth noting that this isn't a story about humans being created weak and dependent. The whole premise requires that humans be capable enough to do what the Igigi could no longer be made to do. What that capacity looked like in practical terms was the management of advanced cities. The first capitals of ancient Sumeria were not simple places. They were layered systems of obligations, towering structures, fragile economies, seasonal labor for maintenance, accounting, legal formalities, and ritual cycles that organized time. All of it required people who could hold multiple timelines in their heads simultaneously, who could track what was owed and what was due, who could coordinate labor across a vast landscape rather than just within arm's reach. The Temu, in their mind's eye, was what made that all possible. It was the cognitive inheritance that allowed a human administrator to look at a swelling river and know, 3 seasons in advance, what the irrigation system would need. It was what allowed scribes to develop the art of writing, first as accounting, then as literature, because to them, writing itself was an ability meant for extending the holy May across time and distance, for holding complex plans in a form that outlasts any single mortal mind. The canals the Igigi had abandoned didn't dig themselves after humanity was created. The tablets are clear that humans took over this work, and the Atrahasis poem frames that transition as the resolution of the divine crisis. When it was done, when Ninhursag had helped shape them to perfection and ushered the first breath into their sleeping forms, the first 14 human beings opened their eyes to gaze upon a pristine earth. 7 men and 7 women. The very first, mankind had been successfully designed to be capable of carrying and sustaining the work the gods had found unendurable. Enlil would stand before the divine assembly and declare the yoke lifted. "I have done away with your heavy forced labor," the text records him saying. "I have imposed your drudgery on man and made restoration. The labor has been transferred, and the sacred workings of the holy May can continue operating in harmony." But underneath that orderly resolution lies the stranger concept, the idea that the whole structure of Mesopotamian civilization, the canals, the cities, the temple archives, the seasonal rituals, the towering ziggurats that would reach toward the sky, they were all understood to have originated by way of a deliberate act of cognitive engineering, a divine act of intervention by the Anunnaki gods themselves. The borders of the civilized world would not be maintained by human ambition or ingenuity alone. They were maintained and perpetually driven by something far older, something passed through bloodlines into the richest soils of the primordial earth, where a quality of intellect that originally belonged to the gods themselves was given, or perhaps installed, into the first human forms, so that the balance of the universe could remain in equilibrium. That understanding left a particular kind of mark on Mesopotamian beliefs, one that can be seen throughout every long thread of their incredibly rich lore. The accounts they left behind leave echoes of an idea that is hard to fully fathom, the idea that human intelligence wasn't naturally evolved, but that it carried within it a trace of something divine, something sacred. It shows up quietly in the way their culture talked about everything from wisdom to the weight of kingship to the sacred obligations of the scribe. The divine knowledge of the holy May would be intricately woven into every facet of their mortal lives, from the rich smell of cedar resin drifting through cool temple walls to simple daily chores. Its essence would bubble up from the Apsu to nourish them like a vital spring. And so, the gods' work was finished, their vision of a bountiful earthly paradise preserved, not with thunder, not with proclamation, but with something quieter, a slow settling, the way a warm fire breathes down to embers after a long night. The dispute that had shaken the courts of heaven had finally resolved itself into something no one had quite anticipated. Not punishment, not surrender, something closer to unanimous relief. The luminous halls where the heavenly assembly gathered that night were lit from within by a warmth that seemed to belong to the walls themselves. The Anunnaki took their seats, and the Igigi, for the first time in longer than memory could clearly reach, sat down beside them as something other than labourers. The beer was sweet. The wine moved steadily around long tables. There was no agenda, no further decree to issue, no channel left to dig, no measurement to take before the sun rose again. The gods drank deeply, and their hearts became elated. Not with triumph exactly, but with the particular likeness that comes when something that has been carried for a very long time is finally set down. Thousands of years of accumulated exhaustion, of cracked hands and weary limbs, and it all ended not with a war, but with a feast, with cups raised in halls that smelled of barley and cedar, with the low murmur of voices that now, at last, at peace. The Igigi drank joyously alongside supreme gods, and somewhere below them their new creations opened their newly formed eyes to gaze in wonder at the world around them. After the feast, the ancient sky settled over everything like a warm blanket laid gently across a sleeping world. The gods moved outward from the lit halls into the open air of the night, the darkness above them thick with stars, not the distant cold stars of a sky you're watching with detachment. The warm and familiar stars of a satisfying night when nothing more is required of you. Each god knew, without needing to say it, that the rivers would still be maintained, that the fields would still be worked, that the order of things would hold, guided by capable hands, hands shaped for exactly this purpose. And far below, in the flat, dark southern marshlands of ancient Sumer, the clay was waiting for them to define its shape. The mud brick streets of the earliest cities were already lingering just over the horizon, waiting to be imagined, to be laid down one careful step at a time, by the people who would eventually dream them into being. The conditions for all that was to come were already in place. The soil of the river valley was deep and rich. The waters of the Apsu had grown still with tranquility, the surface darkening into something like a mirror, reflecting nothing but the silence and the star-speckled tapestry overhead. The underground chambers where the Igigi had uncovered precious ores were now quiet. The fires in those deep places had long since burned down, and the last of the heat was rising slowly through the earth, to dissipate into the cool open air above. A comforting breeze returned to Nippur. It came from somewhere out across the wide plains, unhurried, carrying just enough coolness to soften the warmth of the evening. It moved along winding pathways between the temple precincts and down through the low-lying areas of the city, where the reeds grew thick along the water's edge. It passed through now empty spaces where ancient tools had been thrown down and left for the next caretakers. And then it continued outward, across the flat expanse of the southern plains, across the dark fields and the slow rivers and the unbuilt cities, across all the unmeasured distance of the ancient world. The plains of Sumer were very still. It was a world simply returning to its own natural rhythms, the water settling, the clay resting, the sky doing what it had always done, turning slowly overhead with its fixed and patient lights watching vigilantly from a distance. Whatever had been set in motion, whatever was to come from those long ages of immortal dedication and divine negotiation, it had passed through this period and come out the other side, into a cool, peaceful evening in the quiet plains, the unhurried darkness sinking gently down over everything that had just been created, and everything that had not yet begun. There is a particular kind of silence that only comes after something enormous has ended, not the silence of absence, not emptiness, but the deep quiet of a world that has just shifted its weight, settled into a new position, and doesn't yet know the full shape of what it has become. That is the silence the ancient texts are reaching toward, in the long pause between what we have already heard and what is still waiting to be told. The rebellion is finished. The feast has ended. Newly formed hands are already beginning to learn the weight of tools that were never originally meant for them. And somewhere above it all, in the cool star-scattered atmosphere, a new dawn waits for this mysterious race of gods, just over the horizon. It settles in slowly, the very same way the night settled over the plains of Sumer when the first great epic of their labor was closed. What would follow would present a fascinating new world of primeval concepts, incredibly rich in lore, because in most mythologies, purpose and identity are largely the same thing. To lose one is to lose the other entirely. One cannot have a war god without war, a harvest god in a land where nothing grows. These figures tend to disappear, either absorbed into other names or simply forgotten over time, their temples left to erode into dust, quietly back into the ground. The pattern is familiar, because it's nearly universal. But the Igigi don't quite follow it, and that is what makes the rest of their story worth looking into further. Worth slowly following through the surrounding texts and later records, through the long, unbroken thread of a mythological tradition that stretched across more than 1,000 years of written history. Because the picture that eventually emerges from those records is not the story you may expect. It is something considerably more remarkable and in many ways far more profound. What comes next in their story is not a slow erosion of distant memories of their presence. It is a staggering metamorphosis, one that didn't arrive loudly. It arrived the way the seasons do, gradually, incrementally, slowly, and yet, at the same time, so fast, in ways that only became visible when you stepped back far enough to see the full scale. So, consider this a moment to step back, to let the peace of that last great feast settle over everything, the way the night settled over the plains of Sumer when the last warm lights of their celebration were gently blown out, the way a warm and unhurried darkness spreads across something that has finally come to rest. The Igigi have felt the weight of the world lifted off their shoulders. The divine order has reorganized itself around a solution no one fully anticipated. And now, in the silence, that solution will create inevitable ripples beneath the surface of the story, because the ancient world did not stop needing the Igigi simply because their original role was transferred. The cosmos, as the first scribes understood it, also required maintenance of a different and far more extraordinary kind. It required guardians. It required presence. It required a tier of divine beings willing to stand at the edge of some of the most consequential moments in all of sacred literature and hold steady. The story of what the Igigi became after the rebellion, and the feast and the quiet settling of that ancient night, is a story about what purpose looks like when it's extended, rather than meeting its conclusion. It is a story kept alive through the ages in the oldest written records that human hands have ever touched, waiting for the right kind of patience to read them. And more than that, to really listen to what is being said. And if you are following this deep thread in the darkness of night, listening with the kind of open and unhurried attention that old stories seem to ask for, then you are already exactly where you need to be. Because what comes next poses questions that are seemingly simple at first, and yet yield far more insight than one could ever expect. And perhaps if we look closely, the answer is still there, protected in the earth. It always was. There is a mystery pressed into the oldest written records that human hands have ever produced, not carved into granite, not painted onto cave walls, pressed, wedge by careful wedge, into soft, wet river clay, using the tall reeds of a land that no longer exists in any form that the first civilizations would still recognize today. Ancient Mesopotamia, the rolling flat plains between two great rivers, where the air was thick with the smell of marsh water, and the sky ran unbroken in every direction. That is where some of the earliest written stories were born, and that is where this particular mystery begins. The tablets themselves are easy to overlook in a simple photograph. They're small, rough at the edges, the surface is covered in what looks, at first glance, like nothing more than shallow scratches. But those scratches are known as cuneiform, one of the earliest writing systems ever developed, and they encode something remarkable. They preserve the thoughts, myths, and administrative records of a lost civilization, one that was already ancient when Rome was still nothing more than a humble village on a hillside. Many of these tablets lay buried beneath the shifting sands of modern-day Iraq for more than 3,000 years before anyone found them again. Some were pulled from collapsed palace libraries. Others emerged from the rubble of primeval cities that had been swallowed so completely by time that their very existence had passed entirely from memory into myth. And when one takes a moment to consider the implications, here is what's truly remarkable. Of all the vast archives we have recovered, they are only but a fraction of what remains. Thousands more still lay buried beneath the ground, unexcavated, unread, waiting patiently in the dark, like the silent guardians of a forgotten age. And the tablets we do have, they paint a picture that is genuinely difficult to put down once you start looking at it. Texts like the Atrahasis epic and the Enuma Elish describe a world that existed long before human comprehension. It can be hard enough to grasp the full weight of passing centuries, much less eons. Yet here we witness a primordial landscape still being shaped, when the first great waterways were being cut through the raw earth to give way to lush marshlands that stretched endlessly into the horizon. And in the middle of all of this, a divine hierarchy of immortal beings, a structured order of gods ranked by authority and function, governing everything from the movement of water to the cycles of the sky. At the top of that hierarchy sat the mysterious beings we know as the Anunnaki, the highly revered senior gods of the Mesopotamian pantheon, An and Enlil and Enki, and roughly a dozen others depending on which empire's traditions you follow through the years. They were the ones who held authority, the ones whose names appear again and again across centuries of records, attached to temples, to cities, to the earliest legends of creation, and beneath them, carrying the weight of the entire world on their backs, were the Igigi. 600 of them, according to some accounts, the lesser gods of heaven, assigned to the labor that the senior gods could not perform themselves. Not because they were incapable, but because their primary duties demanded they focus on keeping the very equilibrium of the universe in balance. And so, the task of maintaining the earth had fallen upon the Igigi. They had dug the first channels that became the great Tigris and Euphrates rivers. They had maintained the waterways, worked the earth, and carried the loads that kept the divine order running. The load was great, the toil was grievous, and for what was implied as enormous stretches of time, the Igigi simply endured, until suddenly they didn't. Because one day, according to the myth, they set fire to their heavy tools. They gathered in the night, and surrounded the great temple house of the wind god Enlil, the highest active god commanding the earth's divine operations, where they refused to continue in what was essentially a strike of the immortals, organized defiance from a labor force that had finally reached its breaking point and was ready to declare war. The Anunnaki Council convened in something close to panic, trying to determine what to do with a divine workforce that had simply thrown down their tools and refused to pick them back up. And the solution they arrived at would echo forward through every civilization that came after them. Enki, the wise god of water and deep knowledge, proposed something that had never been done before. He would take the immortal life's blood of one of their own and mix it with the finest clay of the primordial earth. From that mixture came the first 7 men and women to walk the face of the earth. They would find themselves in the marshlands of Eridu, possibly the oldest city known to mankind, whose remnants can still be found in what is now southern Iraq. And from that moment, according to the epic, the labor of the Igigi belonged to them, to us, the canals, the fields, the endless work of sustaining a world. That is the story most people encounter when they first discover the Igigi. And it is a striking one, but it tends to end there, with humanity taking the place of these immortal workers, and the Igigi fading from the frame. This is the version of their story that stops too soon. But it is the way most people tell it. The Igigi rebelled, humans were created to replace them, and then the they quietly disappeared, faded out, dissolved into the background of a mythology that had no further use for them. It's a satisfying ending in a certain kind of way. The workers go on strike, management finds a workaround, and the troublemakers get written out of history. But that's not actually what the texts show, because underneath it all is a question that rarely gets asked aloud, and it is far more interesting than it might first appear. Do the ancient records reveal what actually happened to the Igigi after humanity replaced them? Where did 600 divine laborers go once their purpose was handed to a newly created species made partly from their own blood? Did they simply disappear from the record? The ancient texts offer pieces of an answer, but those pieces require some patience to assemble, and the picture they form is genuinely surprising. Here is where the academic curiosity really begins, and it starts with something that scholars have found quietly puzzling for a very long time. Ancient Sumerian and Mesopotamian scribes were, by any measure, meticulous record keepers. That is the one thing everyone can agree on. The one thing no one questions. They listed kings by name and traced lineages across dynasties spanning centuries. They recorded the names of individual temples, individual priests, individual tracts of land, and who owned them. They compiled lists of divine gods, specific genealogies, tribute records, and incredibly detailed astronomical observations that should have been far beyond their understanding by conventional standards. If something mattered, they named it. They studied and categorized it. They gave it a specific identity and a designated place in the order of things. And yet the Igigi, across more than 1100 years of recorded Mesopotamian literature, remain almost entirely without individual names. They appear, again and again, as a collective, a group, a plural noun. They act together, they suffer together, they rebel together. They are described as a single body rather than a gathering of distinct individuals. Only a handful of the supposed 600 are named anywhere in the surviving texts, and even those names appear so rarely, and in such limited contexts that scholars debate whether they were truly Igigi at all, or simply associated figures from fluid, ever-shifting traditions. Even the membership of the group itself was never fixed. Different cities, different periods, different scribal traditions all assigned slightly different figures to the label. But throughout it all, they remained primarily as a group of lesser gods whose identity was always tied to what they did together rather than what any one of them did alone. It is a puzzle that has remained constantly contested across time. Why would a civilization so devoted to naming and classifying everything leave an entire category of divine beings without individual identities? Time and time again, they are referred to as an ambiguous group, rather than a singular individual. Perhaps we'll never fully understand, but from the memories of our ancestors, we can get a small glimpse. And interestingly enough, that collective voice seems to have persisted, even as their place in the cosmic order began to shift. Because here is what the oldest archives suggest, and what makes this particular thread of Mesopotamian mythology worth following, all the way to the end. After humanity was created to carry the labor the Igigi had abandoned, that same quiet and nameless lineage of immortals did not simply vanish from the records. Their purpose and place simply transformed, not with any dramatic announcement, but across the span of the surviving texts, something changes. This group of divine laborers, who had once dug the very first channels into the primordial earth, suddenly begin to appear in a different register entirely. They appear in the heavens. They appear in high council. They appear alongside the Anunnaki themselves, in the great oath that bound the gods at the edge of the flood myth, standing together as witnesses to decisions that shaped the entire world yet to come. Here we drift through the long shadow of our past, to gaze upon a workforce without faces, as they slowly morph into something that looks, from every angle, much more like a silent court of celestial guardians, watching from the heavens above. How that transformation happened, and what the records actually say about it, is what we are here to explore. And the gap between the popular version and what the records genuinely say is worth sitting with, because it's a genuinely strange thing. The Igigi didn't vanish after humanity arrived. Something more complicated happened to them. To understand what that was, you have to leave the Atrahasis epic behind for a moment and follow a different thread, one that runs through a far less talked about Mesopotamian text, called the Anzu myth. This is a story that most people outside of academic circles have never encountered, but it survives through the ages in a fairly complete Akkadian edition from around the first millennium BCE, and even older fragments that push the tradition back much further than that. Here the Igigi appear once again, not as a distant memory, not as a reference to something that used to exist. They appear as a functioning institution, as a thriving group with a seat at the high table, a voice in divine deliberation, and a formal role in the political and cosmic machinery of the gods. That tells you something important. It tells you that whatever the Igigi became after the labor substitution, it wasn't worth dismissing. So here's the story. At the center of the Anzu myth is a crisis, and it's the kind of crisis that in theological terms represents genuine catastrophe. The Tablet of Destinies had been stolen. And if you're not familiar with what the Tablet of Destinies was to the ancients, it's worth slowing down for, because the heavy stakes at play here only make sense if you understand what it was, and what it meant to the stability of their entire reality as they knew it. Because this particular tablet wasn't a physical object like the clay artifacts we see covered in cuneiform inscriptions. It was a symbol of legitimate cosmic authority and an object of supreme power. Whoever possessed it held the authority to decree fates, to determine outcomes, to speak with the binding force of the divine law itself. It was, in a sense, the operating system of the universe. And the right to hold it was the right to govern all of reality itself. Being the highest active force of the Supreme Triad, it was Enlil's to carry, and then, one morning, it was gone. A creature called Anzu had taken it, a divine bird-like being, enormous and ferocious beyond words. Anzu was described in the texts as having the head of a lion and wings that could stir the very sky. He had been granted a position of some honor in Enlil's household, allowed into the inner chamber, trusted with proximity to the most powerful object in existence. And one evening, while Enlil was in his bath chamber in a moment of vulnerability, Anzu took the tablet and fled into the mountains with it grasped tightly in his talons. The moment he did, divine authority collapsed. Commands lost their force. The gods found that their decrees no longer held. The entire order of heaven was suddenly suspended, hanging on nothing, because the thing that gave it weight was gone. This is where the Igigi enter the picture. When the news of the theft spread through the assembly of gods, the reaction was one of collective paralysis from the highest to the lowest ranking among them. The Anunnaki gathered, and with them, so did the Igigi, sitting speechless and terrified in the heavenly assembly halls. There, in what the myth clearly presents as a formal convergence of the entire divine council, they processed the crisis together. They mourned it, collectively and in silence, the kind of response you have to a catastrophe that has no immediate solution, but one that every conceivable measure must be taken to avoid. Nobody spoke because nobody knew what to say. The tablet was gone, the chain of command was broken, and the gods, for all their power, were effectively without a framework for doing anything at all. What's interesting about this scene is the position the Igigi occupy in it. They aren't there as servants. They aren't being commanded to do labor. They're sitting in assembly with the highest of the Anunnaki, participating equally in a formal response to a divine emergency. They're witnesses. They're an institutional position. Their presence in the room matters because their presence is what makes the council fully complete, fully balanced. By this point in the mythological tradition, the Igigi had already settled into a recognizable role in the hierarchy of heaven, not at the top. The Anunnaki retained that. But they are still very present and very much part of the structure. The council's task was to find someone capable of going after Anzu, crossing the mountains, and defeating this impossible creature to recover the tablet. Several gods were proposed, and each of them declined. The texts are specific about this. The fear of Anzu was genuine. Even the most powerful of their divine warriors hesitated. But eventually the choice fell on Ninurta, the storm god, son of Enlil. And when Ninurta was appointed to the mission, the Igigi were among those who stood witness to that appointment. Their presence at the moment of his commissioning wasn't incidental. It was fundamental. It made the appointment official. It bestowed the full weight of unanimous divine recognition upon the moment their hero had been chosen. That's a fundamentally different role than the one they occupied in the flood stories. In Atrahasis, they were the workforce, the ones who carried the pickaxe and the basket, the ones who burned their tools and refused to dig. In the Anzu myth, they are part of the governing assembly of the cosmos itself, gathered in heaven, decreeing fates alongside the Anunnaki, and bearing witness to the judgments that shaped reality. The transformation between those two images is remarkable, and it happened relatively quickly across the traditions as Mesopotamian theology evolved through the centuries, shifting emphasis, reshuffling the cosmic hierarchy, and reassigning their names and places within it. No temples were built for them as a group. No individual Igigi god accumulated a dedicated cult, a set of rituals, a city that claimed them as its patron. They remained collective, a category rather than a congregation of named beings. But even so, By the time the later Babylonian and Assyrian versions of these myths were being written down, copied, and read aloud, the Igigi had become a category of celestial deity, sky gods who helped their more supreme counterparts keep the balance among all things. The workers of the earthly realm had become, through some strange process of spiritual evolution, gods of the heavens. They gathered above. They gave praise. They assembled to witness the movements of the supreme rulers of the cosmos, and their voices joined the great declarations that rolled through the world like the strongest of storms. It's things like this that tend to get overlooked when scholars trace the Igigi through vast volumes of ancient texts, works written by different priests, in different temples, in different periods of time. Their rebellion story is dramatic, and the creation of humanity is theologically rich, so those legends absorb most of the attention. But if you follow the Igigi further forward through time, something unexpected happens. They don't fade. They don't disappear into the footnotes of history. Instead, they rise. Their identity transforms in ways that the earlier narratives give almost no hint of. And another, one of the places you can watch that transformation most clearly, is in the work of a woman whose name most people have never heard, even though she holds a record that belongs to all of human history. Her name was Enheduanna. She lived in the 23rd century BC, more than 4,000 years in the past. She was the daughter of Sargon of Akkad, the ruler who built what many historians consider the world's first empire, at least by modern-day definitions of the term. Sargon had appointed her to be the high priestess of the moon god Nanna at the great temple complex in Ur, which was one of the most powerful religious positions in the ancient world. But what makes Enheduanna remarkable, beyond just her lineage and her role, is her way with words. She was a writer. She composed hymns, prayers, and poetic texts, and then when her work was done, she signed them. That detail sounds small, but it isn't. As far as scholars can determine from the surviving records, Enheduanna is actually the earliest named author in all of human history, the first person we can recognize and identify by name who put words together and said, in effect, I made this. Prior to that, ancient scribes felt no need to declare ownership of their work, for how can one claim knowledge that was not their own? They had spent countless generations recording the divine wisdom bestowed upon them by the gods, and then copying that information down through the ages as their understanding grew. But it was not theirs to claim. They understood it to be the physical manifestations of an intelligence that was already at play long before they took their first breath. Yet here we see a sudden display of individual ownership. One of her most studied compositions is a text that translators have called Inanna's Elevation, or sometimes the Exaltation of Inanna. It's a complex hymn addressed to the goddess Inanna, and it moves through praise, lament, and cosmic declaration in ways that still feel vivid, even in translation. But the primary reason her works are relevant to this mystery lies in the specific word she chose when she referred to the Igigi. She didn't use the labor context at all. She didn't reach back to the digging or the rebellion or the years of heavy toil. Instead, she used a Sumerian term that reads as Nungal, which translates literally as the great princes, or in some readings, the great sovereigns. That's the frame she chose to place around them. Not workers, not rebels, sovereigns. And that's very important to our historical understanding of how the Igigi were viewed. Enheduanna was not just a casual writer. She was a trained priestess, operating at the highest level of temple scholarship in one of the most literate cities of the ancient world. The words she selected carried weight. When she called the Igigi the great princes, she was drawing on a tradition that had already elevated them well past their origins in the labor myths. Here, within the institutional memory of Ur's temple culture, the Igigi occupied a position of genuine cosmic authority. And to better comprehend how that elevation was portrayed in the language itself, it helps to look at how the more common name of Igigi was actually written to begin with. This is where the lost tongues of antiquity become even more interesting, and you don't need to know anything about cuneiform to follow it. The name itself incorporates a duplication of the ancient Sumerian sign for the word eye. The sign for eye in the old tongue is Igi, and the name Igigi repeats it. The eyes, the watching ones. Some Assyriologists translate the name as the ones who observe. What that means is that embedded in the very spelling of the name, at the basic level of the written characters pressed into clay, is the concept of watching, of seeing, of vigilant attention directed outward across the cosmos. Think about what that does to the labor narrative. The Igigi began in the texts as beings defined by what they carried, what they dug, what they built with their own two hands. But the name itself, the cuneiform identity they carried through every text and every century, was not about hands at all. It was about eyes. And when you move forward through time, away from the flood epic and toward the hymns and legal prologues and the celestial catalogues, that ocular identity becomes entirely dominant. Any other context falls away, and what remains is the image of beings who watch, who preside, who can see the whole picture of things from somewhere above it all. That shift reaches another kind of institutional confirmation in one of the most studied documents from the ancient world. In 1754 BC, a Babylonian king named Hammurabi issued a collection of laws that archaeologists wouldn't recover until 1901, inscribed on a tall black basalt stele. The Code of Hammurabi is famous for its legal content, the 282 rules governing everything from trade disputes to medical liability. But the prologue that precedes the laws is a different kind of text entirely. It's a declaration of cosmic legitimacy. Hammurabi wasn't just announcing rules. He was explaining why he had the authority to announce them at all. The prologue states that the great gods Anu and Enlil, for the well-being of the people, elevated Marduk to be great among the Igigi. That phrase is the key. Marduk's elevation, his designation as the foremost deity in the Babylonian pantheon, is validated specifically by elevating him through the procession of the Igigi. By this time, the they had become the first reference point for appointing supreme cosmic authority. To say that a god stood proudly in the eyes of the Igigi was to say that he stood at the top of the divine order itself. What that means for the legal code is significant. Hammurabi was a human king, deriving his authority from a god whose very sovereignty was defined in relation to the Igigi's approval. The chain of legitimacy ran directly through them, even though they weren't named individually themselves. They functioned as a collective test of divine supremacy, the way a throne functions as a symbol of kingship, even when the king is standing beside it. And in this context, their power came precisely from their collective anonymity. The Igigi, as a group, as a council, as an assembly of watching sovereigns, held a kind of authority that no single deity could have conferred on Marduk alone. There's something almost structural about the way they function in the Hammurabi prologue. They're not characters in the story. They're the framework within which the story of divine authority is told. And that is a long way from the image of gods setting fire to their tools outside Enlil's house in the dark, exhausted from many long years of digging. The same name, the same collective, but occupying a completely different position in the cosmic architecture. What Enheduanna and Hammurabi show, separated by roughly 5 centuries, is that the Igigi underwent a transformation in the textual record that was neither accidental nor gradual in a simple direction. It was a deliberate repositioning. In the oldest hymns from Ur's most accomplished priestess, they appear as the highly regarded princes of the divine realm. In the founding legal document of Babylonian civilization, they appear as the council of highest authority, the body against which a god's right to rule is measured. The eyes of the ancient world, watching from above, far removed from the burdens of their past. But perhaps the most astonishing shift in their legacy came even earlier, from somewhere quieter and in many ways far older in feeling. It comes from the sky itself, because when you move beyond the later traditions, beyond the creation stories, and into the great astronomical and celestial compendiums of ancient Mesopotamia that lie somewhere in between, something remarkable had happened to the Igigi. They had been written into the fabric of the heavens itself. The texts that reveal this most clearly include works like the Enuma Anu Enlil, a massive collection of Babylonian astronomical omens compiled across centuries, and the Epic of Era, a poem that deals with cosmic order and divine authority in ways that still puzzle scholars today. What these texts show, when you read them carefully, is a complete transfer of function, where the same Igigi who once dug canals and labored in the earth were clearly described as the very hosts of heaven. They maintain the harmony and stability of the celestial spheres themselves, operating under the decrees of the highest Anunnaki gods, from Enlil in the older Sumerian traditions, all the way through to Marduk in the later Babylonian interpretations. The labor is still there, in a sense, but the labor has been elevated beyond anything recognizable from those earlier texts. To realize what that actually means, it helps to understand how ancient astronomers divided the sky, and this is where a text called the Mul-Apin becomes essential. It was, in essence, a cataloging document, compiled around the early 1st millennium BCE. Over hundreds of generations of watching the sky from high temple platforms, the ancient priests of Mesopotamia had developed a way of organizing what they saw into 3 distinct regions, 3 paths through the heavens, each assigned to a high god. The furthest and most remote region of the highest realm belonged to Anu, the supreme sky father, the most distant and most powerful member of the Anunnaki Council. Below that sat 2 parallel bands of the sky, one assigned to the wind god Enlil in the northern arc, and one assigned to the water god Enki in the southern arc. Together, these 3 gods formed what you might call the highest-ranking trinity of the cosmos, the Anunnaki in their most concentrated and authoritative form. And this arrangement wasn't symbolic in any loose or decorative sense. It was functional. Stars and constellations were assigned to each path, and the path a star traveled told you which divine authority governed it. But all the while, just below the highest heavens in the space between Anu's remote domain and the lower atmospheric bands where weather and earthly life played out, sat the Igigi. That intermediate region, that middle heaven, was theirs, not the unreachable heights of the supreme gods, not the earthly atmosphere where humans lived and breathed on the very same land which they had once so carefully tended to, but something in between, something that was elevated, but still very much connected to the workings of the world around them, both above and below. And this placement matters more than one might initially think, because the Igigi weren't simply decorating the middle sky, they were governing it. The texts describe them as the controlling intelligences of planetary time itself. Think about what that phrase means for a moment. The movements of Jupiter, which the Babylonians called Marduk or Nibiru, the path of Venus, identified with the goddess Ishtar, or Inanna, the morning star, the measured arc of the moon, the god Sin, and even the daily journey of Shamash, the sun god himself. All of these movements, as far as the ancients were concerned, were not random or meaningless. They were guided, they were maintained, and the entities maintaining them from their fixed positions across the middle heavens were the Igigi. It's worth investigating the specific logic of how the Igigi made this cosmic system work. Fixed stars don't wander. That's what makes them fixed. And in astronomical thinking, the fixed stars weren't just passive background objects. They were structural. They formed a kind of permanent framework, a steady canvas against which the wandering bodies of the planets, the sun, and the moon could be tracked and measured with utmost precision. Priests standing upon the high platforms of the ziggurats used their fixed positions to calculate when planets would appear, when they would reach certain points in their cycles, and even when eclipses might be expected. The Igigi were the unwavering luminous entities filling the lower vault of heaven. Without their guiding lights, the movements of everything else would be far harder to read. They held the visible universe in place, in a very real conceptual sense. The ancient texts described them as structural pillars of a kind, holding up the roof of the sky and keeping the different paths properly separated so that the sun and moon wouldn't deviate from the schedules that governed everything below them, from the floods to the harvests to the proper timing demanded by everything in between. And then there's the question of the gates, because the sun and moon didn't simply exist in the sky in Mesopotamian thought. They moved through it. They rose and they set, and that rising and setting required passage through specific waypoints along the horizon, what the texts describe as the gates of the eastern and western skies. These weren't metaphors in the way a modern reader might assume. They were distinctive features of the cosmological map, precise locations where celestial bodies crossed the boundary between the visible and invisible portions of their journeys from one end of the distant skyline to the next. The Igigi were also said to have functioned as the guardians of those thresholds. They were the ones who opened and closed the horizons at the right times. They ensured that Sin rose when he was supposed to rise, that Shamash completed his arc and descended on schedule. The precision here is important because Mesopotamian religious practices depended heavily on celestial timing. Omens were drawn from deviations, from anything that happened earlier or later than expected. A god who rose at the wrong time was a god delivering a message, and the beings responsible for keeping that from happening without cause were the Igigi, standing at the edges of the visible sky, marking the boundaries between order and disruption. What the astronomical texts are describing here appears almost as a kind of cosmic bureaucracy. And the Igigi, who once formed the laboring underclass of the divine hierarchy, have become its most structurally necessary tier. Not the gods who issue the final decrees, not the Supreme Council deliberating over mortal fates, but the ones who make sure the machinery of the heavens keeps turning, the ones who hold the framework in place so that everything else can be read, measured, and understood. And there's something profoundly ironic in that. The Igigi, in the earliest myths, were defined entirely by their relationship to work that had been imposed upon them by those above them. Their most widely recognized act was a rebellion against that toil. Yet here, in the celestial texts, the Igigi are no longer defined by labor in any diminished sense. They are defined by a higher function, by a position amongst the most luminous deities of the heavenly tapestry, by necessity. They are not constantly grounded in the earth anymore. They are holding up the sky above. And this is where the records get genuinely strange, because the Igigi don't only help guide every luminous body seen dancing across the starry expanse. Some of them were reassigned to a different, yet equally important task within their elevated positions. The Enuma Elish, one of the most complete cosmological texts to survive from ancient Mesopotamia, describes a sort of reorganization of the heavens. Once humans were in place and doing the labor the Igigi had refused to continue, an interesting designation was given to half of their collective population. It is said that 300 Igigi were stationed in the sky, not as rulers exactly, and not as administrators in any political sense, but as something closer to a perpetual choir. Their assigned function was to guard the decrees of the divine council through ritual and sound, through constant hymn and constant praise, singing the laws of the holy May into a kind of permanent stability, and locking the very frequencies of those laws into place. It was a stunning example of the kind of profound early understanding that the ancient Sumerians held about the underlying ordinances of the natural world around them. And it is worth sitting with for a moment, because it isn't purely symbolic in the way we might assume. It's a complexly woven framework that intertwines the underlying frequencies of the universe, the gods who reigned over its highest realms, and how it all interacted with very real, physical manifestations in the earthly realm. In this worldview, the laws of heaven were not perpetually self-sustaining, not all on their own. The ingredients of life were there, and they always would be. But they required maintenance. They required will. They required a united voice. If the Igigis stopped their chanting, if they abandoned their stations and went silent, the framework that held the natural order together would begin to unravel. The sky would stop behaving like the sky. The boundaries between things would soften and blur. Their singing wasn't a pious or prideful declaration of authority. It was load-bearing in a way that is difficult to comprehend. It was a part of the ether itself. That's a remarkable thing to record, and it tells you something about how the ancient Mesopotamian mind understood the relationship between sound, ritual, and cosmic structure. The Igigi had gone from digging the primordial soil of the earth to maintaining the invisible architecture of the future. The work was still endless. The obligation was still total. But the nature of it had shifted entirely from the physical to something much harder to define. What's also worth noting is how the texts describe the number 300 with a kind of precision that feels deliberate. Not an approximate crowd, not a vague estimate. 300. Assigned and stationed. This seems a lot more like the language of an organized system, rather than a myth reaching out for vague grandeur. Whether that precision reflects an older accounting tradition, a symbolic structure within the theology itself, or something else entirely, scholars are still working through. But the specificity is there in the clay. Now, of course, the cosmic division described in these texts didn't fully crystallize all at once, and the clearest and most systematic version of it comes from a much later period, what historians generally call the Middle Babylonian Kassite era, running roughly from around 1592 to 1155 BCE. This was a long stretch of history under Kassite rule, and it produced a remarkably organized theological framework. What the scribes of this period seemed to be doing, at least in part, was taking older, sometimes contradictory mythological traditions and sorting them into a cleaner cosmological structure. It did what large institutional reorganizations tend to do. It gave everyone a place, resolved the tension in the hierarchy, and made sure the ones who had caused the disruption were far enough away that the disruption wouldn't repeat. The Igigi question got a definitive answer in this sorting process. The senior Anunnaki, the older and more powerful tier of the divine hierarchy, were permanently assigned to govern the deepest spaces within the Earth's interior, the underworld, the realm of the dead known as Ker. If you've spent any time with Mesopotamian mythology, you know that the underworld in this tradition isn't a place of punishment, exactly, but it is a place of permanence, a place from which there was said to be no return. And for the very few exceptions that did, well, they didn't return the same way they had left. The Anunnaki going down into that realm carries a weight that the texts don't entirely unpack, but that you can feel it in the language. They weren't being demoted. They were being rooted in the foundations of all things. The Igigi, meanwhile, went the other direction completely. They ascended into the orderly structure of the divine maps that the Babylonian scribes were trying to depict. The sky became their domain entirely. And even while becoming the deities of heaven, they retained the grand power of unity through their collective voice. While the Anunnaki retained their distinct personalities across different texts and under different names. Enlil with his ultimate authority and his temper. Enki with his undisputed cleverness and his compassionate sympathy for all mortal beings. Nin-Hersag with her role in creation at the very beginning. The only gods whose names the texts took effort to differentiate were the ones who had given the orders. These figures remained recognizable as individual characters across centuries of literature. The Igigi did not. As a group, they rose. As individuals, they dissolved. They became a category, a collective noun, 600 presences behind a single label. And the stars themselves were understood as tangible expressions of their divine presence, populating the sky with former earthly caretakers, whose individual names the traditions had simply refused to use, the ones who had carried out the work, refused it, and had then been elevated into the celestial realm to become a part of the sky itself, where they would remain for eternity, unnamed and constant, always present and rarely asked about, the beings whose rebellion had forced the creation of humanity, whose refusal to keep working had changed the very shape of the cosmos, ended up as intrinsic figures in the same heavens at which they'd once gazed upon wishfully from below. And no matter their position, their tireless dedication to maintaining the grand order would never cease, would never fade, would never be swept away by fading memory. Their legend lives on, in the fragments of our past and the memories of our ancestors. And so the story settles, the way all old things eventually do, into quiet. Not the quiet of an ending exactly, more like the quiet that comes after a long fire burns down to its last steady glow. The kind of quiet where nothing is missing, where everything is simply at rest in exactly the place it was always meant to be. Somewhere above the shadows where those ancient clay tablets still sleep in their museum drawers, wrapped in careful darkness and the soft weight of centuries, the sky continues its slow, unhurried rotation, just as it has been doing for a very long time, longer than the scribes who pressed the first cuneiform marks into wet clay, longer than the rivers that carved the valleys where those cities first rose from the mud. The planets move along their ancient tracks with a kind of patience that has no human equivalent. No rush, no deviation, just the steady, almost breathing rhythm of spheres turning in their designated arcs, each one positioned exactly where the oldest calculations said it would be. There is something in that precision that the mind doesn't fully process as much as simply feel. A settling, a recognition that beneath all the noise of recorded history, beneath all the labor and the rebellion, and the long negotiations among gods and men, there was always this, the silent geometry of the sky, organizing itself night after night above every civilization that has ever looked up at it in wonder. Deep in the basement archives of the great museums, the tablets rest in their shallow trays. The script on their surfaces is still there, faint in some places, sharp in others. The marks of a reed pressed into clay by someone whose name was not marked down. The language hasn't been spoken aloud in 2,000 years, and yet the records remain, untroubled, waiting patiently in the darkness, still holding whatever they were asked to hold, without complaint, without effort, simply resting in the way that very old things rest when nothing more is required of them. It's profound to think about, the idea that something can carry so much and then simply be still. The Igigi, in whatever form the later traditions imagined them, became something like that, not absent, not erased, just elevated beyond the reach of ordinary noise. The texts that mention them grow fewer toward the end. The references thin out, and what replaces the detailed mythology is something quieter, a general sense of their presence above, unnamed and unnumbered, watching the way that very old things watch, without urgency, and without demand. The stars they were said to govern still glint along their paths each night, each one moving at exactly the pace the ancient astronomers catalogued. The Babylonian sky charts still describe a universe organized into stations and watches, as though the whole of the heavens were a kind of duty roster for beings too old to need instructions. And underneath all of that, the earth holds what it has always held, fragments of fired clay pressed into the deep layers of soil between the two great rivers, the broken edges of tablets that were never recovered, the impressions of hands that have long since dissolved back into the ground. Countless small objects still sleeping in the dark earth, preserved by the same indifferent weight that preserves everything that sinks low enough and stays still for so long. History does not end. It simply moves at a different pace. It shifts from the urgent and the spoken into the patient and the buried, into the slow accumulation of sediment over stone, into the drift of sweet flower pollen settling into still marshlands, into the faint chemical trace of fires that burned before anyone thought to write anything down by its light. The planets continue their turns. The tablets rest in their quiet drawers. And somewhere above the old valley where the first city stood, the sky is doing exactly what it was always doing, moving in its slow arc. We sleep now in that quiet embrace, in the comforting continuance of history, as the stars around us steadily hold age-old positions, patient and unhurried in the stillness of night. Some stories don't end so much as they recede. They move back from you, slowly the way the light moves back from a shoreline at dusk, not vanishing entirely, just drawing inward, becoming something you feel more than follow in the tangible sense. The story of the Igigi is something like that. It began grounded in the earth, in the dedicated work of shaping an entire world from nothing, and it moved over the course of thousands of years, and hundreds of tablets pressed by hands long since dissolved into river mud, towards something much quieter, something that belongs less to history in the most broad sense of the term, and more to the soft texture of an ancient night sky, one that our eyes were not the first to witness. What the ancient scribes preserved of them in the end was not a biography. It was more like a unified signature, the impression of a presence so large and so old that the culture which recorded it could only gesture in its direction, could only say, they were there, they were many, and the sky kept its order because of them. That kind of testimony doesn't demand that you understand it completely. It asks something simpler. It asks you to sit with the weight of it in contemplation, to let the scale of those numbers and the implications of their accounts settle into you the way sediment settles into still water. Slowly, without effort, until it rests at the bottom and the surface goes clear again. And beneath all of those calculations, underneath the clay tablets covered in angular numbers and planetary positions, there was something more woven into the space between. There was a belief that the sky was held, that its order was not accidental but carefully tended to, that somewhere in the layers above the visible world, in the register that no instrument could reach, something was watching the paths, and keeping the wheel turning at exactly the pace it was meant to turn all along. Whether that was literally true is a question that belongs to a different kind of inquiry. But there is something in the image itself that carries its own weight. The idea that order at any scale requires attention, requires something that shows up consistently without recognition, and does what is needed without asking whether the work will be remembered. And yet the stars they were said to govern still glint along their paths each night, and deep below, the earth still keeps their secrets safe. The clay tablets that carried these stories have mostly slept for thousands of years now, settled into the dark of excavation sites and archive basements, resting in the same quiet way things rest when they have said everything they came to say. Some of them are fragmentary, broken at exactly the moment the story gets interesting, the script trailing off into a smear of pressure marks that no longer resolve into language. The silences in those records are their own kind of information. They tell you how much was left uncarved, how much passed between people in the form of spoken word, and shared understanding that never needed the permanence of clay. And somewhere above them, the ancient astronomers were mostly right about the shape of things. The stars hold their positions with the same unhurried precision they always have, the same arcs, the same slow winding journey along paths that were old before the first scribe sat down with a reed and dedicated himself to preserving them. Whatever the Igigi were in the theology of the people who named them, they found their way into the sky, into the part of the record that doesn't require translation, the part that asks nothing more of you than simply looking up, waiting for your eyes to adjust, and letting the dark settle over everything the way it always has, the way it always will, long after the last clay fragment has been unearthed and set carefully aside for the night.